Sable Varin had not spoken to her husband in 3 years. Not a word. Not a glance across a crowded hall. Not a passing nod in the corridors of Thornhaven Castle. Not so much as a murmured good morning over breakfast, because they had never once shared a meal. She existed in the same sprawling palace as the Alpha King, breathed the same air, walked the same marble floors, and yet she might as well have been a ghost drifting through walls he refused to look at. 3 years since the mating ceremony. 3 years since he had placed his mark on her throat in front of 1,000 witnesses and declared her his Luna, his queen, his eternal bond. 3 years since he had turned away from her that very same night and never turned back. She remembered the ceremony with a clarity that bordered on cruelty. The way the golden light had caught the hard angles of his face when he spoke the vows. The way his voice had been steady and sure, not a tremor, not a hesitation, as if binding himself to her was simply another political obligation to be dispatched with efficiency. The way his hand had been warm against the back of her neck when he leaned down and bit, sealing the bond with a mark on her throat, and the way that warmth had vanished the instant he stepped away from her. He had released her, straightened, looked at her for one long, unreadable moment, and walked away. She had stood there in her ceremonial gown, the bite still stinging on her throat, and watched his broad back disappear through the doors. He had not touched her since. King Dragon Ashvane, Alpha of the Northern Territories, conqueror of the Silthar Uprising, ruler of 6 provinces and commander of the largest standing army on the continent, did not acknowledge his Luna. He did not dine with her. He did not consult her. He did not visit her chambers or invite her to his. When foreign dignitaries arrived and asked to meet the queen, he introduced her with the same flat courtesy he extended to the furniture, present, functional, and utterly beneath his notice. Once, during a treaty banquet, an ambassador from the eastern coast had asked Dragon directly what his Luna's role was in governance. The king had blinked, paused as if the question had not occurred to him, and said, "She keeps herself occupied." Then he had returned to the conversation as if Sable were not sitting 4 seats away, close enough to hear every word. The court had stopped whispering about it 2 years ago. The pity in their eyes had hardened into something worse, acceptance. They had accepted that their Luna was ornamental, a title without teeth, a crown without a kingdom beneath it. Sable had accepted it too, or she had tried to. She had thrown herself into the only work available to her, managing the castle's charitable outreach, overseeing orphan placements in the outer villages, tending to the needs of pack members who had no one else to advocate for them. She had built a quiet, useful life in the margins of his indifference, and she had convinced herself most days that it was enough. Until tonight. Tonight she stood in the shadow of a marble pillar at the edge of the great hall and watched a man she had never seen before bow over her hand and say words no one had spoken to her in longer than she cared to remember. "You are the most captivating woman in this room, Your Grace, and I suspect your king has absolutely no idea what he possesses." His name was Caspian Thorn, ambassador from the Southern Reach. Tall, golden-haired, with a jaw that could have been carved from marble and a smile that suggested he found the world endlessly amusing and intended to share the joke with whoever stood closest. His eyes were the deep amber of old honey, and they stayed fixed on her face with a focus that made her pulse stutter and her cheeks warm in a way she had almost forgotten she was capable of. Sable should have pulled her hand away, should have offered some polite deflection and retreated to her usual corner where the shadows were comfortable, and no one expected anything from her. But she didn't, because across the hall her husband was looking at her. Dragon stood near the hearth, a goblet untouched in his hand, and his dark eyes were locked on the place where the ambassador's fingers still held hers. His expression hadn't changed. That same granite mask he wore for everything: wars, treaties, council disputes, the deaths of soldiers. But something behind his eyes had shifted, something predatory and ancient and utterly furious. Sable's breath caught. Their gazes met across the crowded hall. For one electric, terrifying second she saw him. Not the king, not the political machine. The wolf. And the wolf was watching another man touch what belonged to him. Then he looked away, returned to his conversation with a general as though nothing had happened, and just like that, Sable was invisible again. But her hand was still in Caspian's, and she did not feel like a ghost. The morning after the feast, Sable woke to find a summons on her breakfast tray. Not from the king, never from the king, from Maren Duskfall, the king's chief advisor, and the only woman who had ever held a seat on the inner council. The note was brief and offered no warmth. My chambers, before midday. Urgent. Sable dressed carefully, choosing a simple gray gown that said nothing and drew no attention, the kind of clothing she had perfected over years of trying to be invisible. She pinned her dark hair back from her face and studied her reflection in the tarnished mirror she had never bothered to replace. 24 years old. She looked older, not in her face, which was still smooth and angular and unremarkable by court standards, but in her eyes. There was a tiredness there that sleep could not fix. A resignation that had settled so deeply into her bones, she sometimes forgot it was not her natural state. Maren's chambers were on the 3rd floor of the east wing, far from the king's quarters, far from anywhere important. The advisor was a sharp-featured woman in her 50s, with iron-gray hair cropped close to her skull and a gaze that could peel paint from stone. She had survived 3 alphas, 2 coups, and a border war, and she wore her survival like armor. Sit, Maren said when Sable entered. Sable sat. The Southern ambassador, Maren began, pouring tea with precise movements that suggested the urgency in her note had been calculated rather than genuine. Caspian Thorn, what do you know about him? Nothing, Sable said honestly. We spoke for perhaps 5 minutes last night. He was charming. He complimented the charitable works when I mentioned them. That is the extent of my knowledge. 5 minutes was enough, Maren said. She set the teapot down with a deliberate clink and fixed Sable with a look that was equal parts political calculation and genuine concern. He asked about you this morning. Specifically, he asked why the Luna dines alone every evening, why she has no seat at council, and why the king's own bonded mate appears to hold no standing whatsoever in the pack hierarchy. Sable's stomach tightened. Those are reasonable questions. They are dangerous questions, Maren corrected, her voice dropping. Because they have dangerous answers. He is not simply a diplomat, Your Grace. He is the nephew of Aldrich Thorn, Alpha of the Southern Reach, and there are credible intelligence reports suggesting he was sent here not to negotiate a trade agreement, but to assess vulnerabilities in our leadership structure. And I am a vulnerability, Sable said flatly. Maren's silence confirmed it. The truth settled into Sable's chest like a stone dropped into deep water. A Luna ignored by her own alpha was a crack in the pack's foundation, visible proof that the bond at the center of their power structure was hollow. What would you like me to do? Sable asked, keeping her voice steady. Avoid him? Stay out of sight? I am very practiced at staying out of sight. Something flickered behind Maren's eyes. Actually, no. I would like you to do the opposite. The ambassador had requested a formal tour of the charitable work Sable oversaw in the outer villages, orphanages, healing houses, supply distribution. He claimed the Southern Reach was interested in replicating the model. I want you to be visible, Maren said. For once, I want you to be visible. Let the court see their Luna doing what a Luna does, leading, managing, being competent and commanding. Let the ambassador see that this pack is not as fractured as he suspects. Sable almost laughed. You want me to pretend the king and I have a functional bond. I want you to pretend you have not spent years being erased from your own life, Maren said quietly. Something raw and furious moved behind the advisor's sharp eyes. Something that looked like anger on Sable's behalf, carefully contained but undeniable. Can you do that? Yes, she said. "I can do that." The tour began the following morning. Caspian arrived at the castle gates on a dappled gray stallion, dressed in riding leathers that fit him well, and he clearly knew it. His smile when he saw Sable waiting was immediate, wide, and disarmingly genuine. "Your Grace," he said, dismounting with easy grace. "I was half convinced you would send a steward in your place." "I considered it," Sable admitted, surprising herself. He laughed, warm and unguarded, and the sound turned heads among the castle guards. Sable realized she could not remember the last time someone had laughed in her presence. Laughter required comfort. Comfort required closeness, and no one got close to the king's neglected Luna. They rode out together, and Sable led him through the 3 nearest villages. She showed him the orphanage she had rebuilt from an abandoned grain store, the healing house she had staffed with 2 trained herbalists, paid from her own modest allowance, the supply cache she had established for widows and elderly pack members who could not provide for themselves. Caspian asked questions. Good questions, detailed, specific, thoughtful questions about funding structures, staffing challenges, distribution logistics, and long-term sustainability. He listened when she answered, his amber eyes focused and attentive. He wrote things down in a leather journal. He treated her expertise like it mattered, like she mattered. It was intoxicating, and it was devastating. Because this stranger valued her knowledge more in a single morning than her own husband had since their mating. They returned to the castle as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of copper and rust. Caspian helped her dismount, his hands at her waist, and they lingered there for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, his voice low. Sable nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She didn't notice the figure watching from the tower window above. But Caspian did. He glanced up, met the king's gaze with perfect composure, and smiled. The second day of the tour, Dragon attended the morning council meeting for the first time in a week. What was unusual was the question he asked, 17 minutes into the session, interrupting a report on grain tariffs. "Where is the Luna today?" Marin paused, her hand stilled over the document she was holding. Every head at the table turned toward the king. He had never once asked about Sable's whereabouts. Not where she was. Not what she was doing. She could have vanished entirely, and he would not have noticed until someone raised it in a formal briefing. "She is escorting the Southern ambassador on the second day of his tour of the charitable territories, Your Majesty," Marin said, her voice giving away nothing. "Who authorized this tour?" "I did," Marin said. "As a diplomatic courtesy, the ambassador's request was formally submitted and approved through standard channels." Dragon's jaw tightened. The king said nothing further. But Marin noticed his pen did not move for the remainder of the session, and the page he was supposedly reading never turned. Meanwhile, 40 minutes' ride from the castle, Sable was standing ankle-deep in mud at the Greymoor settlement, watching Caspian roll up his sleeves and help unload supply crates from a wagon. "You do not have to do that," she told him, fighting back a smile. "I know," he said, hefting a crate onto his shoulder with practiced ease. His golden hair had come loose from its tie and fell across his forehead. "But I find that people tell you the truth much faster when your hands are as dirty as theirs." He was right. The settlement elder, a weathered woman named Bridget with knuckles swollen from years of labor and eyes that missed nothing, had been stiff and formal during Sable's last visit. But over a shared lunch of venison stew and coarse bread eaten on overturned crates, Bridget told them what she had been holding back for weeks. The settlement was struggling. Not from lack of supplies, Sable's distribution network handled that adequately, but from lack of protection. Rogue wolves from the unclaimed territories to the east had been raiding with increasing boldness, livestock taken, fences torn apart. 2 young men injured last month trying to defend the perimeter, one badly enough that he still could not use his left arm. "Have you reported this to the castle guard?" Sable asked, her stomach sinking because she already knew the answer. Bridget gave her a look that was kind but unflinching. "We did, Your Grace. Twice. Filed formal reports through proper channels. Both times we were told the king's forces are committed to the northern border and cannot spare patrols for outlying settlements. We were told to manage it ourselves." The words hit Sable like a closed fist. These were her people. Pack members told, in polite administrative language, that they did not matter enough to defend. She thought of the 2 injured young men. She thought of the livestock those families depended on to survive winter. "I will raise this with the council," Sable said firmly. Bridget's expression was patient and skeptical in the way of someone who had heard promises from castle folk before. "Of course, Your Grace." The ride back was quiet. The anger coiled inside Sable like something alive, pressing against her ribs, tightening her grip on the reins until her knuckles ached. Caspian rode beside her in comfortable silence for a long while, reading her mood with an intuition that was deeply appreciated. "You are angry," he observed finally. "I am furious," Sable corrected without looking at him. "Good," Caspian said. "A Luna who feels nothing for her people is decoration. A Luna who burns for them is a leader." His amber eyes held hers, steady and warm. "You have been leading this pack quietly for years, Sable. The only person who does not seem to know it is you." No one had ever said anything like that to her. The words cracked something open in her chest that she had spent years sealing shut with silence and duty, and the stubborn refusal to feel sorry for herself. She looked away before he could see the tears forming. They reached the castle gates at dusk. When Caspian helped her dismount, his hands stayed at her waist. He did not step back. His face was close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his amber eyes. "Sable," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "You deserve to be seen. You know that, do you not?" She nodded, a small, tight movement, and stepped back from his hands before she did something foolish. She turned toward the castle entrance and stopped dead. Dragon was standing in the doorway, arms crossed over his massive chest, his broad frame filling the stone archway like a wall. His dark eyes moved from Sable's face to Caspian's hands, still raised at the height where her waist had been, and then back to her face. Something volcanic was barely contained behind those eyes, straining against his iron control. "Your Majesty," Caspian said smoothly, offering a bow. "Your Luna has been an extraordinary guide. The Southern Reach could learn a great deal from her model. You must be very proud." Dragon's gaze did not leave Sable. "I'm sure," he said. 2 words, cold enough to frost glass. He turned and walked inside without another word. Sable stood in the fading light, her hands trembling, and felt hope. Terrible, dangerous, irrational hope that the man who had ignored her for 1,000 days had noticed she was alive. She crushed it immediately. Hope was a luxury she could not afford. But that night, someone knocked on her chamber door after midnight. Sable crossed the room on bare feet and opened the door expecting she didn't know what. It was not the king. It was Marin, and her face was white as chalk. "Get dressed," the advisor said. "The king has called an emergency council session. He is demanding your presence. Specifically, personally, and by name." Sable had never set foot inside the king's war council chamber. Now she stood at the threshold at midnight, dressed hastily in a dark blue gown with her hair still loose and uncombed around her shoulders, trying to steady the tremor in her hands. The chamber was underground, carved from the living bedrock beneath the castle, lit by oil lamps that threw restless shadows across maps pinned to every available surface. The air was close and warm and smelled of lamp oil and old leather. A long oak table dominated the center, scarred and ink-stained from decades of use, surrounded by 12 high-backed chairs. 11 were occupied by men who looked like they had been dragged from their beds. Dragon sat at the head. He did not look up when she entered. Marin guided her to the single empty chair at the far end, as physically distant from the king as the geometry of the room would allow. General Harkin, a thick-necked man with a voice like grinding stone and a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, was jabbing his finger at a map of the eastern border. 3 incursions in the last 2 weeks, he said, organized, coordinated, targeting supply lines to the outer settlements with surgical precision. This is not random raiding. This is military strategy executed by people who know exactly where to strike and when. The unclaimed territories have never been organized enough for coordinated strategy, a thin advisor named Aldwin objected. They are now, Harkin said flatly. Someone is funding them, someone is arming them, and someone is telling them exactly where our weak points are. Sable's blood went cold. The raids on Greymoor, the livestock taken, the fences torn, the young men injured. It was not neglect or coincidence. It was the opening movement of something much larger. Your Majesty, Marin said. Perhaps the Luna can contribute. She has spent more time in the outer settlements than anyone at this table. Every head turned to Sable, some curious, some skeptical, 1 or 2 openly dismissive. Then Dragon looked up. His gaze hit her like a physical force. For one terrible, suspended moment, she was certain he would dismiss her. Speak, he said. 1 word. The first he had directed at her in longer than she could bring herself to count. Her heart slammed against her ribs, but her voice came out steady. The Greymoor settlement has been reporting raids for at least 6 weeks, she said. 2 formal reports were filed with the castle guard through proper channels. Both were denied reinforcement on the grounds that northern border operations took priority. She paused, letting that settle. Yesterday, the settlement elder told me directly that the raiders appeared to know our patrol gaps. They struck during shift changes and avoided the routes that were still actively manned. Silence. Heavy and absolute. General Harkin leaned forward, his scarred face darkening. They knew the patrol schedules? That is what I was told. The elder is a reliable woman. She has no reason to fabricate. Then we have a leak, Harkin said, each word dropping like a hammer. Someone inside our own operation is feeding intelligence to the enemy. The room erupted. Voices overlapped, accusations flew, fingers jabbed at maps. Through it all, Dragon sat motionless, his eyes on Sable. She met his gaze and held it. She did not look away. She did not flinch or defer or make herself smaller. Something passed between them. Not warmth, not affection, but recognition. He was seeing her as something other than an obligation to be endured. The session lasted until dawn. Sable contributed 3 more times, each with specific intelligence from her years in the outer villages. Settlement populations and fighting age numbers. Terrain details the maps did not capture because they had been drawn by people who never walked the ground. Supply route vulnerabilities she had identified and documented. The names of local leaders who could coordinate civilian evacuations if the raids escalated. By the 4th contribution, Harkin had stopped looking skeptical and started looking respectful. When the session ended and pale gray light was leaking through the ventilation slits, Sable stood and moved toward the door. Luna. She froze, his voice behind her, low and rough from hours of speaking. She turned. The chamber had emptied. Just the 2 of them, oil lamps burning low. He stood near the table, one hand resting on the map he had been studying for 5 hours. Up close, the sheer physical scale of him was overwhelming. He was broader than she remembered, harder, as if the years of distance had carved away whatever softness might once have lived beneath the surface. He looked exhausted in a way that spoke of something deeper than a single sleepless night. The intelligence you provided tonight, he said. It was useful. Useful. That was the word he chose. Not valuable, not impressive. Useful. I have more, she said. Years of records from every settlement visit, supply logs, census data, infrastructure assessments, security observations, all documented, all organized, if you want them. Have them sent to Marin, he said. Not to me. to Marin. Even now, he could not engage with her directly. She turned to leave. "The ambassador," Dragon said. Sable stopped but did not turn around. "The tour is concluded, effective immediately. All further diplomatic engagements with the southern delegation will be conducted through official channels, not through you." He was cutting her off from Caspian, not because the diplomatic objectives had been met, but because he had seen another man's hands on her waist and could not tolerate it. Years of absolute nothing. And now this. Sable turned to face him. "Is that an order from my king, or a request from my husband?" The question hung between them. His eyes widened, the first unguarded reaction she had seen from him since the mating ceremony. Something cracked behind his mask, desperate and confused and furious. Then his expression shuttered closed, like a door bolted from the inside. "It is an order," he said. "Then I will obey it. As I have obeyed every silent order you have given me. Stay quiet, stay invisible, stay out of the way." Her voice did not waver. Her eyes did not leave his. "Will that be all, Your Majesty?" He said nothing. His hand on the table had gone white at the knuckles. She left the chamber, her back straight, her chin lifted, her heart fracturing with every step. She made it to her chambers before the tears came. She pressed her back against the locked door, slid to the cold stone floor, and wept. She wept until she was hollow. Then she washed her face, straightened her spine, and made a decision. She was done waiting for him to see what she had built. She was done waiting for him at all. But as she climbed into bed, something nagged at her. Harkin had said 3 incursions, all targeting supply lines. Her supply lines. The routes she had personally designed, mapped, and documented in meticulous detail. Someone was dismantling her work specifically and deliberately, as though they had studied her records and knew exactly where every weakness lay. And the only people who had ever had access to those records were inside the castle walls. 3 days passed. Sable threw herself into preparation with a ferocity that startled even Marin. She compiled every record she had ever kept, years of settlement reports, supply logs, census counts, terrain surveys, security observations, all organized into a comprehensive dossier that filled 2 leather folios and represented more actionable intelligence on the outer territories than the king's own military scouts had produced in a decade. She delivered the folios to Marin's office personally, along with a formal written request for a council audience to present her proposal for a settlement defense network. Marin read the request, set it down, and looked at Sable. "You know he will resist this." "I know." "You know that standing before the full council and presenting a military infrastructure proposal will make you visible in a way you cannot undo. You will be a political actor, and political actors attract enemies." "I know that too." Marin studied her for a long, quiet moment. Then she nodded once. 2 days from now. Sable spent those 2 days preparing with an intensity that left no room for doubt or second-guessing. She mapped every settlement in the outer ring, identified the most vulnerable supply corridors, calculated the minimum patrol rotations needed for a credible deterrent, and drafted a funding proposal that drew from existing military budgets without requiring new taxation. It was thorough, practical, and politically defensible. She rehearsed her presentation alone in her chambers until she could deliver every point without notes. On the morning of the council session, she dressed differently. Not the gray gowns of invisibility she had worn for years. She chose deep green, the color of the Northern Territories, the color of the crown. She pinned her hair up properly and barely recognized the woman staring back from the mirror. The council chamber was full when she arrived. Harkin was already there, arms crossed, watching her enter with that grudging respect she had earned during the midnight session. Marin sat near the middle, face carefully neutral, and Dragon sat at the head, looking terrible. Dark circles had carved themselves beneath his eyes, his jaw set so tightly she could see the muscles bunching beneath the skin. She presented standing. She spoke for 20 minutes without interruption, laying out the threat assessment, the defense plan, the funding structure, and the implementation timeline. Her voice did not shake. Her hands did not tremble. She held Harkin's gaze when she discussed military logistics, held Marin's when she addressed political implications, and held Dragon's when she spoke about the pack's duty to protect its most vulnerable members. When she finished, silence filled the room. Harkin spoke first. "It is a sound plan. Better than sound. Some of these terrain assessments are more detailed than anything my scouts have produced." He looked at Dragon. "I recommend immediate implementation, Your Majesty." Two advisors voiced agreement. A third raised a funding concern that Sable addressed on the spot with figures she had memorized. The momentum was building, the shift from skepticism to endorsement palpable in the room. "Your Majesty," Marin said, "the Council awaits your decision." Dragon had not spoken once during the entire presentation. His expression was something she had never witnessed, raw and complicated, as though he was seeing something that filled him with pride and carved him open with shame simultaneously. "Approved." The word came out hoarse, scraped raw. "Effective immediately. The Luna will oversee implementation in coordination with General Harkin." The Luna will oversee, not Marin, not a steward. Her. The council dispersed. Sable gathered her documents and moved toward the door. She was almost through it when she felt a hand close around her wrist. She turned. Dragon stood directly behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. His fingers overlapped easily around the narrow bone of her wrist. It was the first time he had touched her since the mating ceremony. The bond between them, dormant and starved for so long she had almost forgotten its presence, roared to life. Heat flooded through her from the point of contact, rushing up her arm and spreading through her chest like wildfire. Her wolf surged forward with a desperate, aching whine that vibrated through her entire body. Dragon's pupils dilated. His nostrils flared. He felt it too. She could see it in the way his grip tightened, the way his breath caught, the way his whole body went rigid as though he had grabbed something electrified and could not let go. "Your presentation," he said, barely above a whisper, rough and strained. It was not merely useful, it was extraordinary. His thumb moved, a small, involuntary motion, stroking once across the inside of her wrist where her pulse hammered beneath the skin. The sensation shot through her like lightning. His eyes dropped to the place where his thumb rested, watching her pulse beat against his fingertip, and something desperate moved across his face. Then he released her, stepped back. The mask slammed down. "Report to Harkin tomorrow at dawn." Flat, controlled, as if the last 30 seconds had not happened. "He will assign you a security detail for the settlement visits." He turned and walked away without looking back. Sable stood in the empty corridor and pressed her hand against the wrist he had held. The skin was still warm. The bond was humming through her bones like a bell struck and left to ring. She was in so much trouble. The settlement defense network launched within the week. Sable rode out with General Harkin and a contingent of soldiers to establish the first patrol routes, and she discovered something unexpected in the process. She was good at this. Not just the charitable work, not just the supply logistics, but the strategic coordination, the terrain analysis, the ability to read a landscape and understand where threats would come from and how to counter them. Harkin noticed it too. "Where did you learn to read terrain like that?" he asked on the third day, watching her trace a ridgeline on the map that his own scouts had classified as impassable. "I have been walking these territories for years, General," Sable said. "You learn a great deal when you are the only person who bothers to show up." Harkin grunted, which Sable had learned was his version of high praise. The work consumed her. It gave her a purpose that felt larger than survival, larger than the quiet endurance she had practiced for so long. She was building something that would protect lives, and she belonged in this pack. Not because of the bond, not because of the crown, but because of what she was doing with her own hands. Caspian Thorn remained at the castle. The trade negotiations were ongoing, handled through official channels as Dragon had ordered, and Sable saw the ambassador only at formal dinners where conversation was polite, public, and carefully observed. Something had shifted. She no longer needed his attention the way she had that first night, when his gaze had been the only mirror in which she could see herself. She was becoming visible on her own terms now. What had not changed was the bond. The moment Dragon had touched her wrist, something had woken between them that refused to go back to sleep. She felt him now in ways she had not felt him in years. A low, constant hum of awareness that followed her everywhere. She could sense his mood through walls and floors, a distant pressure against her consciousness like weather rolling in from far away. He was restless, agitated. Something was eating at him from the inside, and the bond transmitted it in waves of tension that kept her awake at night. Then the attack happened. Sable was at the Greymore settlement, reviewing the new patrol positions with Brigid and two of Harkin's lieutenants, when the alarm went up. A horn blast from the eastern perimeter, long and piercing, followed by a second. 2 blasts meant a large force. "Get inside," Sable ordered Brigid. "Everyone who cannot fight, into the stone cellar beneath the meeting hall. Now." She turned to the lieutenants. "How many soldiers on rotation?" 12, the senior lieutenant said, his hand already on his sword. "The raiders have never come with fewer than 20. Take 6 to the eastern fence line. Hold the gap between the grain stores. I will take the remaining 6 to the ridge above the north approach. If they try to flank, we cut them off before they reach the settlement." The lieutenant hesitated. "Your Grace, with respect, you should be in the cellar with the civilians." "I know this terrain better than anyone alive," Sable said, already moving. "If you want to survive the next hour, follow me." They followed. The fight was fierce and short. The raiders hit the eastern fence line hard and were met by Harkin's soldiers in a defensive formation Sable had suggested the week before. When the flanking force tried the north approach, they ran into the soldiers Sable had positioned on the ridge. The high ground was decisive. Sable did not fight. She was not trained for combat. But she directed the defense from the ridgeline, calling out movements, coordinating the 2 groups through shouted commands relayed by runners. When a section of the eastern fence collapsed and the raiders poured through, she redirected soldiers from the ridge to plug the gap before it widened. It was over in less than an hour. The raiders retreated, dragging their wounded. Not a single civilian was harmed. Sable stood on the ridge as the dust settled, her hands shaking so badly she had to press them flat against her thighs to stop the tremor. She leaned against the nearest tree and breathed until the world stopped spinning. Dragon was waiting at the castle gates. Not inside, not at a window. Standing in the open courtyard in full view of guards and servants. His face was white, not pale, white. When Sable rode through the gates, he moved. Long, ground-eating strides, and before she had fully dismounted, his hands were on her, checking her arms, her shoulders, her face, running over her body with frantic, urgent efficiency, searching for wounds. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice cracked open in a way she had never heard. "Sable, are you hurt?" Her name. Not Luna, not your Grace. Sable. "I am fine," she said, stunned into honesty by the raw terror on his face. No one was seriously hurt. His hands stopped moving. They were cupping her face now, his thumbs resting against her cheekbones, and he was staring down at her with an expression that dismantled every wall she had built. His eyes were dark and wild and wet, and his breath was coming in ragged pulls, and the Alpha King was shaking. "I felt it," he whispered. "Through the bond. I felt the moment you were afraid and I could not reach you." He swallowed hard. "I thought I was going to lose you." "You cannot lose something you never held," Sable whispered. The words came out like a reflex, years of grief compressed into a single truth. Dragon flinched. His hands dropped from her face. She watched the shutters come down, watched him rebuild the mask piece by agonizing piece. Report to Harkin, he said flatly. Full debriefing, written account by morning. He turned and walked into the castle. Sable stood in the courtyard, the ghost of his palms still warm on her face, and felt the bond screaming. That night, she could not sleep. The bond pulsed with something she had never felt from him before. Not restless agitation, not cold emptiness. This was grief. Raw, oceanic, drowning grief that poured through in waves powerful enough to make her gasp. He was in agony, and she understood at last that it was not because he did not care about her. It was because he did. Sable went to Marin the next morning. I need to understand, she said without preamble, closing the door behind her. Why does he do this? I know he feels the bond. I felt what he felt last night, and it was not indifference. So why? Marin set down her pen. She looked at Sable for a long time, and something shifted in her face, a softening she rarely permitted herself. Sit down, child, she said. Sable sat. What I am about to tell you does not leave this room, Marin said. Not because it is a state secret, but because it is his, and he would be furious if he knew I was sharing it. She paused. Your mating was arranged. You know that. What you do not know is why. Politics, Sable said bitterly. Alliance building. The usual reasons. Survival, Marin corrected. Dragon took the throne at 19. His father was taken from him during the Silthar uprising, struck down in his own council chamber by men he trusted. Dragon was forced to assume command of a fractured military, fight a relentless guerrilla campaign across terrain that favored the enemy, and make decisions that no one that age should ever have to face. The war lasted 2 years, Marin continued. By the time it was over, Dragon had buried more friends than he could count. He had ordered strikes that caught civilians in the crossfire when rebel strongholds were struck, because the alternative was letting the uprising spread. He had passed judgment on men who betrayed him, men who had been his father's most trusted officers. Sable's throat tightened. When he returned from the mountains, the boy was gone. What came back was the king, you know. The stone face. The silence. The absolute refusal to let anyone close enough to wound him. Marin's voice was quiet and precise. The council pressured him to take a mate. He resisted for years. And when he finally agreed, he chose you. Why me? Sable asked, the question she had carried since the ceremony. Because you were kind, Marin said simply. He saw you once, at a harvest gathering in the outer villages, distributing blankets to the elderly. You did not know he was there. He watched you kneel in the mud beside an old woman who could not stand and wrap the blanket around her shoulders yourself. And he told me afterward, in the only moment of genuine emotion I had seen from him since the war, that you were the gentlest person he had ever seen. Sable's vision blurred. She pressed her fingers against her eyes. He chose you because you were gentle, Marin said. And then he could not bring himself to touch you because he was terrified of what he would destroy. He has watched what his hands do. They command armies. They send men to war. They break things. The idea of those hands touching something kind and good was more than he could bear. He thought he was protecting me, Sable whispered. He was protecting himself, Marin corrected gently. There is a difference, and he has never learned to see it. Protecting you would have meant being present, being vulnerable, risking the possibility that you might see the worst of him and stay anyway. What he did instead was build a fortress around himself and leave you standing outside it. That is not protection. That is cowardice, dressed up as sacrifice. Sable wiped her face. What changed? Caspian Thorn changed everything, Marin said. For years, Dragon could pretend his arrangement was sustainable. You were safe. You were provided for. And then another man walked into his castle and looked at you the way Dragon has been terrified to look at you since the day he chose you, and the entire structure collapsed. Jealousy, Sable said. Terror, Marin corrected. Not that you would leave him. He believes he deserves that. terror that you would be happy, that someone else would give you what he could not, and he would have to watch it happen, knowing it was his own cowardice that made it possible. It did not excuse what he had done. She would not let it, but it changed the shape of the pain. It turned a locked door into one that might, with enough force and courage, be opened. "I need to speak with him," Sable said. "He will not agree to see you." "Then I will not ask his permission." The guards at Dragon's study stepped forward when they saw her approaching. "The king is not receiving visitors, Your Grace," the senior guard said. "I am not a visitor," Sable said. "I am his mate. Move." They looked at each other. They looked at her face. They moved. She pushed the door open without knocking. Dragon stood at the window, his back to the room, silhouetted against pale afternoon light. He did not turn. He knew it was her. "Sable, do not do this." "I am already doing it," she replied, and closed the door behind her. He turned. The look on his face, raw and desperate and stripped of every defense, broke her heart and rebuilt it in the same breath. "You owe me the truth," she said, stepping closer. His hands hung at his sides, shaking. "I watched my father die because he trusted the wrong people." The words came out low and stripped bare, nothing left but honesty. "I held men while they fell in the snow because I gave the orders that put them there. I carry the weight of every life those orders cost, and every time I look at you, I see the one good thing in my life that I have not yet destroyed." His voice cracked. "I stayed away because I was afraid that if I got close, I would ruin you too." Sable crossed the remaining distance and placed both hands on either side of his face, the way he had held hers in the courtyard. "You ruined me anyway," she said softly. "You just were not close enough to see it." His face crumpled. The Alpha King, the conqueror of the Silther Uprising, the man who commanded armies and ruled 6 provinces, crumpled. His forehead dropped to hers. His hands came up and covered hers, and he broke. "I am so sorry, Sable." "Then stop being sorry," she whispered, "and start being here." He kissed her, desperate and clumsy and shaking, like a man who had forgotten how. His hands found her waist, her back, her hair, touching her like she might vanish if he let go. And Sable kissed him back with everything she had been holding inside. Every lonely night, every ignored morning, every time she had pressed her hand against the mark on her throat and wondered if the man who put it there remembered her name. When they finally broke apart, his forehead still pressed to hers, the bond pulsed with something new, something warm and steady and golden, like the first light of morning after an endless dark. "This is not fixed," Sable said, because someone had to say it. "One kiss does not erase what happened. I know. I am still angry. You should be. And I am not leaving." His arms tightened around her. "Thank you." But outside the study window, moving through the courtyard below, Caspian Thorn paused. He looked up, saw the 2 silhouettes standing close together, and his expression shifted. The warmth drained from his amber eyes, replaced by something calculating and cold. He turned away, walked to the guest wing, and closed his chamber door. From inside, the faint scratch of a pen on parchment. A letter being written, sealed, handed to a servant with quiet instructions and a coin that ensured silence. The letter bore the crest of the Southern Reach, and it was not addressed to his uncle. The days that followed were fragile, not broken, not healed, but something in between, like a bone that had been set but not yet fused. Dragon did not retreat. He did not rebuild the walls, but he moved through the new closeness with careful, hesitant steps, like a man walking across ice that might crack at any moment. He began joining Sable for meals, not every meal, and not with any announcement. He simply appeared at her table one morning, sat down across from her, and ate in silence. She did not comment on it. She poured him tea and passed the bread and let the quiet exist between them without trying to fill it. The second morning, he spoke. The Eastern Patrol reported no activity overnight. It was a military update delivered over porridge, but it was information he had chosen to share directly instead of routing through Marin, and Sable understood what that meant. He came back the next morning, and the one after that. The court noticed. The whispers were different now, not pitying, curious, cautious, hopeful even, from those who understood what a functional bond at the center of the pack would mean for everyone. Sable did not trust it. She wanted to. But trust was not a feeling. Trust was a pattern built over time, and they had barely begun. "You are being cautious," Dragon observed one evening. They were walking the battlements together, a habit that had developed without either of them naming it. The wind off the northern mountains was cold and sharp and smelled of pine. "Yes," she said. "You do not believe this will last." "I believe you mean it," Sable said carefully, watching the distant tree line darken against the twilight. "I believe you are trying. But trying is not the same as staying." "What would staying look like?" he asked. The question was genuine, almost vulnerable, as though he truly did not know. "It would look like this," she said. "Every day. Not just when it is easy or when another man threatens what you thought you could ignore. Every day, especially the ones where you want to disappear behind the mask again." He turned to look at her. The wind died for a moment, and the silence between them was enormous. "I will try," he said. "That is why I am still here." They stood together on the battlements as the last light faded, not touching, not speaking, but present. Both choosing to remain. The peace lasted 4 days. On the 5th morning, the council chamber was already in chaos when Sable arrived. Harkin was on his feet, his face thunderous. Marin stood beside her chair, pale and rigid. 3 advisors were speaking over each other, and Dragon held a letter, his face carved from granite. "The Southern Reach has withdrawn from trade negotiations," Harkin told her. "Effective immediately. All diplomatic personnel ordered to depart Thornhaven within 48 hours. "Caspian," Sable said. "Gone before dawn," Marin said quietly. "No formal farewell, no explanation. Just a sealed letter delivered to the gate." "The letter is not a diplomatic withdrawal," Dragon said, his voice dangerously calm. "It is a declaration. Aldrich Thorn is claiming sovereign authority over the unclaimed Eastern territories, the same territories where the raids have been originating." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. "He funded the raids," Sable whispered. "Caspian's uncle. He was behind the attacks all along. The trade negotiations were a cover. The tour of the charitable works, the questions about supply routes and infrastructure, he was gathering intelligence. Through me." Every detailed question Caspian had asked, every supply corridor she had shown him, every terrain feature she had pointed out during their rides together. She had handed the enemy a complete map of her pack's weakest points, and she had done it willingly, gratefully, because someone was finally paying attention. "He used me," she said, her voice hollow. "No," Dragon said. Every head turned to him. "He used the situation I created," Dragon said, heavy with something Sable had never heard from him before. "Accountability. I left you invisible and isolated and starved of every form of recognition a Luna deserves. I created the exact conditions that made you vulnerable to manipulation, and Thorn exploited them with surgical precision." He looked at Sable, and his eyes were burning. "This is not your failing. It is mine." Sable stared at him across the war table. The man who could not apologize days ago had just claimed full responsibility for a strategic catastrophe before his entire council. Harkin broke the silence. "If Aldrich Thorn claims the Eastern Territories and garrisons them, he controls the supply corridors to half our outer settlements. We will be cut off." "Then we do not let him garrison them," Dragon said, rising to his feet. Mobilize the eastern battalions. I want defensive positions established along every corridor the Luna mapped. Her infrastructure plans become our military blueprint. He looked at Sable. You know that terrain better than anyone in this room. Will you lead the defense coordination? Not will you help. Not will you advise. Will you lead? Yes, Sable said. The war preparations consumed the next 3 weeks. Sable worked alongside Harkin and Dragon, mapping defensive positions, coordinating civilian evacuations from the most exposed settlements, and establishing communication lines between patrol outposts. She slept in snatches, ate when she remembered, and drove herself with a ferocity born of guilt and determination in equal measure. Dragon matched her hour for hour. He consulted her on every strategic decision. He deferred to her knowledge of the terrain without hesitation or ego. And when the day's work was done and the advisors had filed out, he walked her to her chambers. He did not come inside. He did not ask. He simply walked beside her through the quiet corridors, his presence steady and warm, and said goodnight at her door. On the 4th night, Sable stopped at her door and turned to him. You do not have to escort me. I know. Then why do you? The torchlight caught the angles of his face, and she could see the exhaustion carved into every line. Because I spent years walking past this door, he said quietly. I would like to stop walking past it. The Southern forces advanced faster than anticipated. Within 2 days, Aldrich Thorne's army had occupied 3 key positions along the eastern corridor, cutting supply lines to the outermost settlements exactly as Harkin feared. The intelligence Caspian had gathered was devastatingly accurate. The guilt was a living thing inside Sable. Every settlement cut off, every family trapped behind enemy lines, she absorbed like a blow she deserved. Dragan found her in the map room late one night, staring at the position she had helped Caspian identify, her fingers tracing supply routes that were now enemy territory. Stop, he said from the doorway. She didn't look up. 14 families in the Ashvin settlement are cut off. Stop. He crossed the room and took her hands from the map. You are doing what I did, taking something that is not entirely your fault and making it the only thing you can see. I showed him everything, she said, her voice cracking. You showed a diplomat the charitable works you built to keep this pack alive, Dragan said. You showed him the best of who you are. That he weaponized it is his crime, not yours. She looked up at him. His dark eyes were fierce and certain and full of something she was beginning to recognize as love. Not the desperate panic of the courtyard. Something deeper, with roots. I spent years blaming myself for the war dead, he said quietly. You taught me that guilt and punishment are not the same thing. Let me return the lesson. He pulled her against his chest and held her while she wept. Not the way she had wept alone on her chamber floor after the midnight council session. This time, someone was there. When she broke, there were hands to hold the pieces. We are going to get those families out, Dragan said against her hair. Together. Your defense network works in reverse. Same corridors, same terrain advantages, same local knowledge. We use everything you built. Sable pulled back, wiping her face, her mind already turning. The North Ridge above Ashven. I know a path that is not on any map. It runs through a ravine that is impassable in winter but clear right now. If we move a small force through at night, we can reach the settlement from behind the southern line without being detected. Show me, Dragan said. She turned to the map. Her hands were steady now. She traced the path she had walked dozens of times, through terrain she knew in her bones, and laid out a plan that was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its precision. Dragan studied it. Then he looked at her with an expression beyond admiration or gratitude. Recognition. He was seeing her completely, not as a vulnerability, not as a burden, as his equal. Harkin will want to move at dawn, he said. Tell him to move at midnight, Sable said. The southern patrols change shifts at midnight. There will be a 12-minute gap in coverage on the eastern approach. Caspian told me that himself. She paused, a grim smile crossing her face. He thought he was making conversation. He was giving me the key to dismantling his own uncle's strategy. Dragan stared at her. Then he laughed. A real laugh, short and rough and startled out of him, and the sound filled the map room like something long overdue. "Midnight, then," he said. The midnight operation succeeded. Sable's path through the ravine held. The patrol gap was exactly where she said it would be, and Harkin's forces reached the Ashfen settlement before dawn. The 14 trapped families were evacuated without a single casualty. The success broke the Southern Line's momentum and gave Dragan the leverage he needed to negotiate from strength rather than desperation. The conflict with the Southern Reach did not end overnight. It took months of negotiation, strategic positioning, and the quiet, relentless work of rebuilding trust between settlements that had been frightened and cut off. Sable oversaw every piece of it, not from the shadows, not filtered through Marin, directly, openly, as the Luna of the Northern Territories. Dragan did not disappear behind the mask again. Some mornings were harder than others. Some days the old silence crept back, and he would go quiet for hours, retreating into the fortress inside his own head. But he always came back. He always found her before the day ended, sat beside her, took her hand, and stayed. "You stayed," he said to her one evening on the battlements, months later, as the first snow of winter dusted the northern mountains. He said it like he still could not quite believe it. "I stayed," Sable confirmed, "even after everything." "Especially after everything," she said. He pulled her close, her back against his chest, his arms wrapped around her against the cold. She felt the bond between them, steady and warm and real. Not the fragile thing it had been in those early days, but something forged and tested and unbreakable. She leaned into him and watched the snow fall over the kingdom they were learning to lead together. Not as king and ornament, not as alpha and ghost, as partners, as mates, as two people who had chosen, finally and irrevocably, to stay.